Ladies, gentlemen, and travelers of all ages, especially those of you with a propensity to curse anything that looks at you the wrong way, today is all about how to make this game absolutely, unbelievably, completely just trivial. How do you like the sound of generating so much ward that the game literally does not know how to display it on your screen, and the counter breaks multiple times over, I should add. Technically speaking, I've had as high as about 180,000 ward at one point in my current setup. You just can't see it all on the bar at the same time because once you go above around 65,000, it just goes back to displaying 1 and then counting again, which is genuinely hilarious to even get to see. But this build goes so far beyond that it is clearly a bugged interaction. That said, from what we know about this bug, if fixed, it will lead to about a 80 to 90% reduction in our ward, which sounds like a lot until you remember that 10 to 20% of 180,000 ward is still somewhere around the 25,000 ballpark, and I am literally still level 93. My gear is decent for sure, but far from perfected. The point being that with this bug, we can be essentially immortal, but an important way of how we are building this specific build is more tankiness past the bug itself, so that when this does definitely eventually get fixed, you aren't left in just a non-functional build. You are still in a top tier clearing setup. So we've got crazy ward, we have quite a strong layer of defense even behind that ward itself, and then we of course have our offense too, which is absolutely dominated by a really fun combo that I first saw used by the Curse, so credit for the base concept, but I'm not sure if it did originate elsewhere, that's just where I first saw it, which is the concept of causing ourselves to bleed, using Maylin's Hubris, the unique gloves, to turn our self-bleed into a self-ignite, together with the Immolator's Oblation belt, which comes from the boss at the end of the Soulfire Bastion dungeon on tier 3 and 4, and this belt turns stacks of Ignite on the player into bonus spell damage while active, with my version giving me 5 spell damage per stack up to 40 stacks, which is of course 200 bonus flat spell damage, and this is a medium roll on this effect. You can get 6 spell damage per stack, and that's just an absolutely nutty amount that you could possibly gain here. Then we go full in on the damage of Torment itself, which is the damage over time curse that comes mainly from Chthonic Fissure, our big main Warlock skill. The main reasoning for this is because damage over time in Last Epoch in almost every instance is a snapshot, meaning rather than constantly updating the damage of each tick of a dot on an enemy, it takes the stats and damage when the dot is first applied and then keeps it for the entire duration of the effect, especially effective for curses. And if you reapply Torment while Torment is already on the enemy, it will simply reset the duration. It will continue the counter, not update the damage number that is on it. Basically, that is just a lot of explanation to say that we light ourselves on fire when we cast, we stack cast speed to light ourselves on fire faster, which gives us more stacks. The more stacks of Ignite we have, the more spell damage we have, and then we apply Torment while at high stacks to snapshot these damage buffs. Then we have various ways of pushing that even further, and it is all on top of a bed of near immortality until you hit like multiple thousand corruption levels of deep endgame monoliths, on which note it is worth mentioning the footage that you're looking at of the build in action is all around corruption 260, which is simply where I was able to get to before stopping to actually show this to you all. All that stuff said, then you now probably have a pretty clear idea of why you would want to use this build, especially because, again, even when they do eventually nerf the Broken War generation, we have enough other things in here to make it still one of the top tier builds in the game no matter what. So let's dive into how to actually make it, the skills that we specialize into and where these points go within them, the passive points that we use as well, the uniques and the rest of the gear that we have, as well as just a general stat priority on top of that, and then we'll just go over the actual gameplay loop and how to play it properly for maximum effectiveness. Beginning with these skills then, let's start off with Chthonic Fissure. By the time that you hit level 80, which lets you equip the Twisted Heart of Eucharos, you will have 2 bonus points to put into this for 22 total quite easily. And 22 is what I would say is the perfect sweet spot for Chthonic Fissure, enough to genuinely get a boost of power over the default 20, but not so many that you're just putting them somewhere irrelevant because you have them. That said, let's talk about where they actually will go, and I won't over-explain every single node so much as just pointing out the most important ones and the order in which you want to seek them in. And first you want to head left and down to Damned Waters over here and put 2 stacks in it. This makes the spirits that come out of Chthonic Fissure apply Damned, 2 stacks at this rank, but it also unlocks the ability for us to put 3 ranks into Twisted Waves. This makes Torment deal more damage per 2% uncapped necrotic resistance. Anytime you see the term uncapped resistance in this game, it means that the effect will scale past the normal 75% threshold for damage reduction itself, which is why I currently have 557 necrotic resistance, as you'll see over here, which results in an 835.5% increase to our damage that Torment will actually deal because of this node right here. As well, it also lets us put 1 point into Grim Tide, and this makes both the Fissure and the Ailment, meaning Torment and Damned at this point, deal more necrotic damage per added crit multiplier bonus that you have as a character. And so there you can see our two main focuses to build for our actual damage: necrotic resistance and crit multiplier, which is fun because normally you obviously wouldn't use crit multiplier in a damage over time build, as it simply doesn't crit. And on top of this lets us have a build that builds crit multiplier without building crit chance at all. Past that, you would actually want to work your way over to Of Gloom and Flames, heading up the left here, which extends the Chthonic Fissure, like visually, essentially making two of them back to back in a line instead of just one. This both lets it cover greater area, so it can apply torment to more enemies in general mob clearing situations like monoliths, but also if an enemy is standing right in the middle of them, it takes damage from both separate fissures at the same time. They look like they're one really long one, but it is just two back to back, and that makes it really good for bosses and rares. Then you also want to grab Fellfire over here, which will make it so that when you torment an ignited enemy, it will spread all of their ignite stacks from it to another enemy around it, but also this is a gateway to let us get 3 ranks of Tomb Gorger, which makes torment deal more damage if the target that it is on is also ignited, poisoned, or bleeding, and we will be igniting every enemy, so this is just a ton of bonus damage for torment, pretty much just in general. Then you want to slide to the right side for 2 ranks of Death from Below over here, which basically just gives you bonus damage with Chthonic Fissure that is also doubled if we are cursed, which we don't really get. But then your final points go into Eradication down here, which is just a bunch of bonus damage with Chthonic Fissure into rare enemies and also bosses, and also this effect is doubled if either we or the enemy themselves are cursed, which they of course will be permanently, so it's just a lot of bonus damage to these enemies. Then let's talk about our most actually cast ability, which surprisingly is going to be Spirit Plague over here, our second curse, and our main actually castable one. This is our main spammed ability in this build for 4 separate reasons. Number 1, it costs 0 mana, or more accurately, it costs 3 mana normally, but we actually are going to be using a wand in our actual weapon slot, which has -3 spell mana cost as an implicit, and thus makes Spirit Plague literally cost 0 mana. 2, it has no cooldown, so you can spam it quite easily. 3, the first node that we're going to be investing in is Pestilence right here, which increases your global damage over time stat, which is a separate multiplier, every time that you affect an enemy with Spirit Plague, and this stacks up to 13 times for a very significant damage over time increase, again as a separate multiplier, which is really nice to have. Then the fourth reason is that after that we head immediately up and to the right, we get Hemorrhage over here, which makes Spirit Plague enemies also count as bleeding, and 5 points into an Exsanguination, which gives the Spirit Plague bleed penetration, but also makes it apply 5 stacks of bleed to us, the player, every time we cast Spirit Plague, and that is our main combo. 5 stacks of bleed per cast from this, plus a chance from the extra stack from the belt itself. Then the gloves will turn bleed that we put on ourselves into ignite, and with that we spam cast Spirit Plague for the massive flat spell damage boost from our belt. We also then grab Plague Bearer over here just for another ailment to be applied to our enemies. We also grab around left and wrapped around to the Plague of Eyes node here for bonus Spirit Plague damage per intelligence that we have, and of course we're going to be stacking intelligence quite a lot regardless of this, so this is just a nice bonus damage. And the other particularly important nodes here are going to be Perpetuity over here, which we have 3 ranks into, and this is mostly important just because it increases the duration of Spirit Plague, but also more importantly for our purposes, it increases your cast speed while using the skill by 60%, which lets us build our self-ignite stacks much faster and thus higher. Then we have a really fun combo. This is the big bug that the build has right now, but just to really drive the point home even when it's fixed, this will still be insanely good without the bug. It just won't be the literally most broken thing in the whole game anymore. And to explain it properly, we should probably start with Profane Veil over here, which is a very unique skill, putting you into a weird ball state, letting you go around as a sort of spirit concealed within another realm, going around with 100% dodge chance, just literally dodging every single attack that would come into you, and also giving you a bunch of other bonus effects that we'll be getting through the tree itself. And with this, you actually want to beeline it immediately down here to the right to get Vampiric Pool, and this is just your strongest survivability skill here. This makes Profane Veil consume up to 10 minions within its radius while active, both increasing the maximum duration of the channel itself, and also giving you a portion of those minions' health as ward. The number here itself says that it gives you 4% of their health as ward, but it seems that someone got a number wrong here because in actuality this is counting in the game as 40%, not 4, which is why we are hitting the ridiculous ward numbers that we do. It's all in this node, but because of ward decay and how that whole system works, even if they do fix this, it won't be a literal 90% reduction in our ward. It will be a bit less than that, which is why earlier I said 80 to 90%, but it will still be a pretty notable change. You also want Penitent Tangent up here, which is another ailment, more than anything just scaling the effects of our main unique unique weapon. Then past that, we're going to be going for Scorn, which is more global damage to cursed enemies while in Profane Veil, which does include the tick damage of all of our damage over time effects, and this is a pretty hefty damage increase all in the node in itself. You also want Stream of Profanity, which makes casting a curse directly reduce Profane Veil's cooldown, and this makes us spamming Spirit Plague give us even more goodness, as this means our general gameplay loop just makes this skill active more frequently, almost by default. Then we also want Sable Inquisition down here for a larger area on Profane Veil. And put simply, these three skills and their ranks are essentially decided by the difficulty and style of content that you are mainly doing at the time. You want to switch them around based on where you have to. Sable Inquisition here is fantastic, specifically for more lazy speed farming type stuff. Maybe you're doing monoliths far below your actual pay grade, far below your limit, and you just want a simpler brain off kind of run to the end experience, and the large area from this simply means that you have to move less with Profane Veil to consume all of your Bone Prison minions and get your ward, because the bigger radius just absorbs them easier on the move. Generally, I think this one is incredible for anything but bosses, but for bosses you want to fill out the other two quite a bit more. Scorn is simply more damage, which is why I generally recommend filling this one out no matter what, and the Profane Veil cooldown reduction over here is specifically great if you want more tankiness, or again, are doing specifically bosses more than anything else, as Profane Veil is a notable damage increase more in single target than faster mob clearing. Another good option, especially for when the ward eventually gets nerfed, is Spirit Plate over here, just one singular point to make your armor apply 2 damage over time while in Profane Veil, which is massive because Profane Veil already gives you 100% dodge chance while active, so the only thing that can hurt you while it is active is damage over time, so having your armor apply to that just reduces that significantly more and makes you even more immortal than the immortal you already would be with the rest of this build. Then for the second part of this ward combo, we have another skill here, which is going to be Bone Curse specifically. You want to head directly down here, 3 points into this just to let you get to Bone Prison itself. What this does is make Bone Curse create bone walls on the edge of its radius. As you can see from its extra information as well, the Bone Prison counts as a minion, and each section of wall counts as a separate different minion. So what this does is create 12 minions essentially on cast. Then we take full ranks of Osprey over here to boost the health of each of these Bone Prison minions by 2500, so each by 2500, giving them a total of 3000 health per wall segment. With the bugs to Profane Veil's numbers, that means that this combo gives us 12,000 ward as a default, but then of course to make this silly, we also stack minion health affixes, which is why we have 1036% minion health, at least in the gear that I'm currently using, which makes each minion in this bone wall essentially have around 30,000 health instead of 3,000. And so you can see where our massive bursts of ward are coming from here. Past that, we're also going to be grabbing Shattered Prison over here just to significantly reduce the cooldown duration that Bone Curse gets from Bone Prison itself, which actually makes the cooldown of Bone Curse line up pretty well with Profane Veil if you are spamming the Spirit Plague, which you actually will be doing for a lot of points that you want to be getting more survival. Then with the rest of our points here, we're going to be going down the right side, making Bone Curse apply Mark for Death, increasing the duration of Mark for Death as well, and if you don't know, Mark for Death is not only another ailment, which boosts the effects from our unique wand, but also reduces the resistances of every enemy that it affects, which does make you do more damage in general. Then we just also take Misery over here to turn the physical damage from Bone Curse into necrotic damage, just so it scales a lot better with our actual necrotic damage bonuses. Then for your final points, you want 2 points here into Defile Defenses. This makes Bone Curse have a chance to reduce enemy armor, just gives it armor shred chance, which is nice in itself, but it also lets you put 3 ranks into Marrow Thief, which makes killing an enemy affected by Bone Curse have a 30% chance to give you bone armor, which is quite nice to have as a secondary way of applying this, because we also apply it through one other method in the build, and you could argue that this is either a synergy or an anti-synergy, but I like that it's another way of applying something that we boost through another skill, which is going to be Transplant, our final skill here, which is mostly mobility, but we have some extra effects on it too that makes it even better. You want to start with the skill by passing left here, mostly for the bone armor node itself, which makes bone armor apply to you every time you use Transplant. In what bone armor actually is what you can see here, which is 300 armor and 12% less damage taken. But on top of that, we take a bunch of nodes here surrounding it, 2 points into Plated Bone to make bone armor itself 20% more effective on both the armor and damage reduction parts, as well as 3 ranks into Apostasy for longer duration on bone armor, 3 seconds. So it's now up for 7 seconds and has a 10-second cooldown. The cooldown starts when the effect is applied to you, so realistically you'll have this for 7 out of every 10 seconds between Transplant and also the Bone Curse version of the application as well. Then you want to go to the right side and instead put a couple of points into Acolyte's Fervor to get you into Rain of Blood, which makes Transplant create an additional exploding body when you arrive, but more importantly, it lets you put 3 points into Violent Emergence over here, which essentially gives you an execution for low health enemies anytime that you teleport on top of them. Essentially, if you teleport onto an enemy that has 15% health or less, they will just die, including including bosses or rares. So this is extremely potent if you play around it for sure and you're aware of its existence. Then, as you can see, I have 1 point unspent because I was messing around with testing other things, and where that would go is pretty much personal choice, but mostly I recommend Scarlet Rain over here just for an extra 20% radius on the teleport effect itself, mostly for the execute proc, just to make it easier to execute larger groups of enemies and things like monoliths, for example, if necessary. And that covers all of your actual active abilities then, so let's go over the passive point tree that we're going to be using for this build, starting off with the Acolyte, of course, the base class, in which you have to spend 20 points to be able to do pretty much anything else. And of course, we're going to be starting off with 8 points in Forbidden Knowledge, which gives you a bunch of intelligence and also necrotic resistance, both extremely good stats for us. 6 points into Stolen Vitality up here, a bunch of vitality, which is health, necrotic resistance, and poison resistance, as well as a bunch of minion health, which of course gives us a lot more ward in itself. After that, we put 1 point into Mania of Mortality for some ward gained on nearby death, but mostly just to unlock the ability to put 5 points into Unnatural Preservation for 40% ward retention, which is a really nice amount to get from 5 skill points, as well as 20% necrotic resistance, which is just more damage, and then 20% poison resistance, which is, just some resistance. It doesn't actually give us damage like the necrotic does, but it's nice to have anyways. After that, we have our Lich points over here, and we put a fair whack of points into Lich, though it's worth noting that if you're sort of leveling and progressing with this build, I would leave these points until your mid 50s to 60s just to make sure that you get Profane Veil unlocked as early as possible, as it requires a lot of points put into Warlock to actually get it, and it's pretty much a linchpin of this build. You don't need it to use the build, but you do need it to make the build actually function extremely well, especially against things like bosses, so just keep that in mind. But our Lich points then are going to be 10 points here into Apocrypha for the intelligence and mana regen that it gives us, 5 points into Grasp of Fate for a bunch of bonus necrotic damage, of course that affects everything that we do really, 5 points in Desolation for increased damage over time and minion damage over time, but mostly just to unlock the ability to put points into Crippling Insight over here, which is an extremely high value per point node, 2 intelligence per skill point. That is more than any other intelligence skill point node in the entire passive tree, but it comes at the cost of some reduced health regeneration, which again we just don't care about because our tankiness doesn't come from our health, it comes from our ward and things like our armor underneath the ward as well, not to mention Profane Veil just making you immune to being hit in the first place. And that's all of our Lich points, so let's move on to our proper mastery Warlock tree right here. Starting off with 5 points in Soul Stealer, which gives us a little bit of increased mana regen, as well as actually the 5-point bonus here, which gives us a chance to actually gain mana when you hit an enemy, depending on how many curses they have. And the amount of mana that you gain is 13, and it has a 3-second cooldown before each trigger, and this is just a very interesting skill in itself, as it feels like it's sort of the perfect threshold where without these points, we start to have mana problems in any longer encounters. But with these skill points here, we are perfectly sustainable permanently without issue. Then we grab 5 ranks over here of Occultist Mind for extra intelligence, as well as the 5-point bonus of just giving us bonus mana per point of intelligence we have. We stack a ton of intelligence, so this just gives us a larger mana pool to work from in the first place. After that, we put 6 points into Unholy Torment, bonus spell damage for curses, which is of course great, as well as being flat damage, which scales quite nicely in various situations, and increased area for curses, which mostly affects Spirit Plague and Bone Curse more than anything else. 3 out of 5 points here in Ward of Malevolence. The main thing that this gives us is Ward Decay Threshold as an actual flat number. We have tons of percentage-based bonuses to our Ward Decay to make it actually decay slower, but those percentage bonuses need a higher flat number to work from to really boost it properly, and this is where a lot of our flat number actually comes from. And what this does is just make the actual massive burst of ward that we get when we use the Bone Prison and Profane Veil combo and take it and make it actually decay much slower, because it's nice to have a burst of like 100,000 ward, but it's not great if it goes back down to 0 before you use it again, because it'll just be killed when you're at 0. So what this does is even it out nicely, make it start slowing down the decay around 20-30k, just to make it so that you have a really nice buffer where you're unlikely to be murdered in between cooldowns of your actual burst. On top of that, 3 points here lets us put 3 points into Imperishable, which is some extra ranks of vitality, which I explained earlier, quite nice, and the 3-point bonus of bonus ward decay threshold per 1% necro resistance. Unfortunately, this does not stack with uncapped necrotic resistance, so it doesn't go all the way up, but this is just another 75 ward decay threshold, and I just explained why having more flat ward decay is actually very important. Then you put 3 points into Doom Herald for now, which makes you take less damage while you are channeling, and also makes you do more damage to damned enemies while channeling. Essentially what this does is make it so while you hold Profane Veil, you do more damage and take less damage, and that includes your torment damage, which is really good in itself. After that, you want to put 5 points into Wither for 100% chance on hit, which is not only a bonus ailment for our synergies, but also increases the damage that enemies take from all of your other curses. It's fantastic, and it stacks, and the 5-point bonus also makes it reduce the enemy's damage to us. 1 point over here in Anguish, just to activate the effect in the first place, which makes direct curse casts inflict enemies around them with Anguish, which is another necrotic damage curse that makes enemies deal less damage, so even more survivability, and specifically we want this for bosses, which is why we only put 1 point in it, because usually there's only one enemy that you actually want to target this with. Then you want to put 10 points into Malefic Body up here for a bunch of bonus intelligence and vitality, both incredible stats for us as we've gone over multiple times at this point. 2 points into Chaotic Strikes right here, which gives you a chance to deal double damage against an enemy. The chance is increased per curse that is on them as well. And then we put 5 points into the beautiful Wreak Havoc. The 3-point bonus from this makes the double damage from Chaotic Strikes have additional critical strike multiplier, but just in general, this increases your critical strike multiplier by 40% as a whole. And again, that's just 40% pure bonus torment damage, which is really good for us to have. And at that point, we have put enough points into this tree to unlock Accursed Seer, which we're going to put full points into to get increased cast speed 20%, as well as 25% increased cast speed specifically for curses. The 3-point bonus is a little bit of survivability, which might apply once the actual ward bug has been dealt with, but right now it's not really important. What we take this for is essentially, when you combine them together, 45% increased cast speed specifically on Spirit Plague, which gives us faster ignite generation, which gives us more flat damage whenever we cast spells. It's just a really solid use of 5 skill points. And after that, you'll have a few left, so we'll put 5 more into Fleeting Crone right here, which gives you a chance to gain haste for 2 seconds when you kill a cursed enemy, or if you just hit a cursed boss or a rare enemy, and the chance is 25%, so you're pretty much going to have this active constantly. You will just constantly have haste with this build. And on top of that, it also gives you a 50% increased effect of haste, which makes it give you 45% bonus movement speed instead of the standard 30% that you would normally get with haste itself. And at this point, personally, I am level 93, which means that I have 7 points left to spend from this stage, and those 7 points are going to be going to these 2 nodes right here, just filling them out. 5 points into Doom Herald to just increase the damage that we do to damned enemies while channeling, as well as reducing the damage that we take while channeling too, and then the remaining 2 points into Warded Malevolence, just to boost our ward decay threshold a small amount more, as we talked about how important that is. Finally then, let's go over our gear. We've got a build planner for all this down in the description to make it easier to actually follow, and it has all of the ideal item subtypes and the affixes that you would want on them, everything like that. So for the sake of conciseness here, I'll just be going over the uniques that we use specifically, as well as a general stat priority to aim for on any of your gear, and your legendary crafts too. For the uniques themselves, a few of these we have already talked about. Immolator's Oblation enables our massive spell attack gain per ignite stack on ourselves. Malin's Hubris over here lets us ignite ourselves by turning our self-bleed into self-ignite. Then we have the Twisted Heart of Eucharos from the Emperor of Corpses boss in the Reign of Dragons Monolith timeline, and this one is a little bit tricky. I like it all the way from when you can first use it at level 80, especially because it gives you extra ranks in 4 out of 5 of our skills, but if you really want to focus on offense more than defense, you can avoid putting this one on until you turn it into a worthy legendary with something like crit strike multiplier and necrotic resistance on it, just to bump the offensive game. But personally, I consider it more than worth it just for the extra skill ranks, honestly. And in case you're wondering, this does give 2 extra skill points to Chthonic Fissure, as it both counts as a fire and necrotic skill and thus gets both boosts, which is neat in itself. Then we have our weapon, which is going to be the Mad Alchemist Ladle. This gives you a chance to apply slow, frailty, shred armor, electrify, and poison on every hit, and then gives you 6% more spell damage against an enemy per negative ailment that they have, up to 8, and we apply so many different ailments even outside of all the application chances on the weapon, so this is just essentially a 48% spell damage increase, at least against any enemy that lives long enough to have everything applied. But then, you also, more importantly for us, gain 1% cast speed per 2 intelligence. Again, we are currently at 124 intelligence, so this is a 62% cast speed bonus from this unique effect, which is important for getting our Spirit Plague fast enough to reach the top cap of self-ignite stacks for the belt buff itself, before the ignite duration just sort of runs out of time and falls off. Then for our helmet, we have the Bone Claymore Barred Boot, and this is an incredible helmet specifically for this build that again will probably come more into play once the ward bug has been fixed, as it's mostly based around survivability. Armor, dex, intelligence, a ton of necrotic resistance, which is pure percent damage gain for torment, which makes it great for the build, and then 1 ward per second per uncrapped necrotic resistance. We already stacked necrotic resistance, and with my current 557%, that is an extra 186 ward per second from this helmet, which is a pretty lovely little chunk. For the rest of your gear then, for item subtypes, again, we have this in the build planner, but you essentially just want any of the higher level subtypes that also give you either necrotic resistance or something like ward decay based implicit affixes. Aside from the one exception, which is going to be your boots, if you can get Citadel boots with a tier 7 crit bonus damage reduction affix, this is literally all of your crit survival concerns sorted in a single item. They also have a massive chunk of armor as an implicit affix as a base, which is incredible in itself. As far as a general stat priority then, this is where it gets fun, because while the bug is active, the first stat to focus is actually minion health until around 500% bonus gain. That is around the sweet spot where you become unkillable by like 95% of enemies in the whole game. Anything past that is just for higher corruption pushing. Aside from the bug interaction then, 75% resistances is ideal to have, though as you can see with mine, you can really get away a long time without having them at that level while this ward bug exists. But put simply, resistances are the highest intentional tankiness gain per affix required in the game, and the lack of defenses is what will stop you from climbing to higher corruption long before actual damage stops you then, as there's no real timer on these activities past your own patience. Past that is going to be cast speed that you want most until you can cast Spirit Plague fast enough to actually reach at least 40 stacks of Ignite on yourself consistently. Anything higher than that is still good because it keeps you at 40 stacks longer into using other skills, but once you reach that threshold, you can start focusing crit multiplier on pretty much any piece of gear that can fit it, as again, it is pure percent damage increase to torment that stacks separately from damage over time bonuses, and thus each individual bit of crit multiplier is more effective than just stacking even more damage over time bonuses. Not to mention the chaotic strikes passive effect too that we have in our skill tree, then it's necrotic resistance above 75%, and honestly by the time that your build is quote unquote complete, ideally fully kitted out, you want to essentially have a tier 5 necrotic resistance affix on every piece of gear that is not a legendary, and honestly even if you have your legendaries. Then after that it is going to be intelligence. Obviously our general damage scales with intelligence as a whole as a warlock, but intelligence also gives us bonus ward decay, which is great for our survivability too, and we have a bunch of different passives and nodes within our skills themselves that give us bonuses with actual intelligence scaling off of intelligence itself, including again the cast speed on the Mad Alchemist Ladle. Past that you want bonus spell damage for curses. This is a flat damage bonus for your curses, and this has a sort of specific application, but it's also a very important specific application. You just want a touch of this specifically for monoliths more than anything else, as this boosts the base damage of torment as a curse before we do all of our buffing with Spirit Plague and Self-Ignite and Profane Veil, which makes it better just killing random mobs without the build-up of it, while running directly to the objective of, say, an Echo in a monolith without putting much thought into it. Obviously it does help the build in all cases, more damage is more damage, but mostly it's just an ease of use addition. Past that, offensively you just want things like necrotic penetration wherever you can get it, damage over time bonus is really good, as well as necrotic damage bonus too, but again the necrotic penetration, really important because pretty much all the damage that we do is necrotic, and penetration is a really important stat if you can get it. The best place that you could put it is to actually smush it onto your ladle once you turn it into a legendary. I got unlucky with my roll, but I still got the crit strike multiplier, so I'm still pretty happy with mine, to be completely honest with you. And then finally, defensively, which is going to be unnecessary until the ward bug is changed, but once it is, the best defensive step that you can take from here is to add more armor, just raw, pure armor, because this gives you general damage reduction to all types of damage in the game that will also apply under our ward, as opposed to something like endurance, which does not synergize with ward. And that pretty much does it for all the things that you need to know about how to actually put this build together. And it's worth mentioning, aside from the belt specifically, the setup of uniques is actually really cheap to pick up if you are with the Merchants Guild faction, and even the belt itself is just a few 100,000 gold currently on the market, so this is actually pretty easy to get up and running early on, and I'd say you can effectively play this build as early as level 47 or so if you have the uniques, as that is the level requirement to be able to use both the belt and gloves together, which is the most important item synergy part of this combo, at least offensively speaking. With all that said then, let's go over how to actually play it. Transplant is your movement skill. This lets you fly around the place in monoliths, darting to objectives quickly to help build corruption even faster, but it also gives us bone armor with 70% uptime, which is just great defensively. Bonus armor, bonus damage reduction, even scaling outside of that. As well, Transplant has an execute effect if you teleport on top of an enemy that has 15% or less health, so use it for speed, use it to avoid dangerous telegraphs on things like bosses, or use it to finish off low health enemies purposefully. It does also apply Frenzy and Haste to us, but we get both of those from other methods as well, so that doesn't matter quite as much, but you do generally want to use it on cooldown, and it's good to be aware of. Bone Curse is good to apply to enemies, but much more important to use just to create the Bone Prison minions on cooldown within your path of movement. Spam use Spirit Plague to apply curses to enemies, give yourself Pestilence stacks, and reset the cooldown of Profane Veil, as well as applying Ignite stacks to yourself. Then you want to cast Chthonic Fissure, and all Torment procs from the spirits that come out of this will snapshot to the damage bonus from the Ignite stacks that you currently have when they are applied. Profane Veil is both for absorbing the Bone Prisons themselves to give you these massive bursts of bugged ward on a short cooldown, as well as increasing the damage you do while you hold the channel, as long as your curses are still being applied to the enemy. So the basic loop for Monoliths is to start by throwing a Bone Prison under your spawn point every time, and using Profane Veil to just give yourself a massive safety net of ward before you even encounter an enemy. Then just transplant towards the objectives, leaving unbuffed Chthonic Fissures along the way. If the enemies that are behind you survive more than 1 or 2 ticks of Torment, just fire off a couple of Spirit Plagues in between to make it do more damage. Then reuse the Bone Prison and Profane Veil combo anytime your ward drops to unsafe levels for the content level that you are doing, with the caveat that you should also use Profane Veil offensively speaking against any higher health targets like bosses or rare enemies at the ends of a monolith. For bosses, you also want to start with Bone Curse for Bone Prison and Profane Veil, transplant into the fight, and spam Spirit Plague until you are at minimum 40 stacks of Ignite. Then throw out a Chthonic Fissure, Bone Curse, and hold Profane Veil until the Chthonic Fissure on the floor is about to run out. Then repeat this whole process over and over until the boss hits 15% health or lower. At that point, transplant on top of them to execute them and end it early. Otherwise, in bosses, just use it mostly as a movement tool or to reapply bone armor once every 10 seconds. And that pretty much does it, honestly. The power of this build is absolutely unbelievable. I mean, I don't know how much more I can really say for it than I have, other than that while this will always be strong, this will always be a top tier Warlock build pretty much for the rest of time, this specific version of it right now, before it is eventually nerfed, is an absolute treat of a power fantasy to experience. So if you have the opportunity, I would definitely mess around with this bug while it exists, because being this hard to kill in a game like this is just plain fun to build around. I hope you've all enjoyed this then. Hopefully you've enjoyed my higher movement focused version of an igniting Torment Warlock build, specifically tailored to still be more than effective for when the ward bug is eventually removed. Let me know your own thoughts on this. Maybe there are some variations that this inspires you to create, or maybe you just like the look of it and want to start putting it together yourself as is. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.